Welcome to Community Watch, and today we're having a fascinating conversation with Dr. Bentley Gibson on implicit bias. Stay with us. Community Watch starts now.
Welcome to Community Watch. Greg, how are you?
Just fine, brother. And yourself?
I am good, and I am excited about our guest today. And, you and I have talked about having Dr. Gibson here in the past, and finally we've been able to get her to talk about some of her areas of expertise. But our guest today, Dr. Bentley Gibson, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I know we've been talking about doing stuff like this, so I'm excited to have the opportunity to do this on this Monday.
Well, for the two or three people who may not know you yet, I want to make sure that they know that you are a professor of psychology at Georgia Highlands College.
That's
One of our absolutely finest professors as well. I have students just rearranging entire schedules to take. It's crazy.
That's
but
beautiful.
I understand totally.
That melts my heart because this is where I began with you.
Well, I know that there are a number of things that we wanted to talk about today, but one of the things that we wanted to talk with you a little bit about is the training that you do, and you've been doing it, I know, outside of the college, but a lot of it inside the college on implicit bias training.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what that is, and I know Greg will have. I may not be able to ask enough. This will be my only question of the show because I think Greg will take over after that. But
that's fine. Throw them at me.
Tell us a little bit about what implicit bias is.
Totally. This term came about, and it's also interchangeably used with unconscious bias. But in the 90s, social scientists said, look, we have to go beyond asking people what their biases are because A, they may not be aware of them, and B, they may not want to talk about them, right? So in the 90s, they came up with this implicit association test. And that's really where my research began in 2008, I think that was, where I began to dive deeper into the research that was already done on how can people assess their own unconscious biases through what's known as the implicit association test. And so people go and they take this test, and sometimes they're surprised by their results because they're like, no, this is not what I thought. But look, the real story is very few people on these unconscious bias assessments can see Blackness as positive, can see women in the workplace, can see gayness as positive. Most people have what's called a pro-white, pro-straight, pro-male in the workplace bias. And it's until people have those individual understandings of their own biases, not until then will we see real movement in society, I feel. And so I've just taken the science and studied this implicit bias as much as I can to see like what really shifts people to really see these groups that are negatively stereotyped unconsciously as positive, because even well-intentioned people, if they have these unconscious biases, can do things that they may not have intended to do.
Now, Dr. Gibson, so the test itself, because I've taken the test several times on different subjects, because to me, I just find it interesting. You start taking it and kind of, but the test itself, for those naysayers or those who may be critical, how did the test come about? And I guess the accuracy of the test, or how realistic is the test? Can you speak to that?
Yes. And so the test came about, again, just going past asking people to self-report their attitudes. If you say to somebody, hey, are you racist? Are you sexist? There's some confounds there, right? So the test came about and said, in terms of social scientists saying, can we measure what's going on in people's brains about these topics that are difficult to talk about without asking them, right? And so that's what the test is doing. It is rooted in science, but it's not a perfect test. There's no such thing as a perfect test, but there's research behind, look, it does have real world meanings for who we hang out with, who we find. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you all. We had a little technical bit. And I was on a roll.
You were. But while you was on a roll, because, you know, the reason I asked that is that I was thinking just my own biases. You know, the construct of black and white, I'm very comfortable with.
Yes.
But when I thought about the shootings this past week with Asians,
Okay.
and a lot of people may not realize that, well, I guess all African Americans may not realize too, but Asians and African Americans have not always had the best relationships. And so I was just thinking about when I was hearing about all of this, you know, my biases came, I was like, you know, is there a test for that? Because it would have been interesting for me, because I know going back years ago, I can't remember who, but the young lady that was murdered, shot in the convenience store. And just some of the
Are you talking
past
about the
baggage.
African American woman who was shot in the convenience store? Yes.
Yes. And so I was just thinking about some of that baggage, and I was like, you know, it would be interesting for myself if I took one, you know, as it relates to Asians, because
Very good.
and so because I would just that awareness that I could have those and probably do have some, I was like, you know what, I wonder if there's a test for that. Because
Well, there is a test. If you go to the website, it's not as well validated in the research as the black and white race test, but there is one on, do you have biases for European American features versus Asian American? There is not one that you can take that looks as between black versus Asian. But Greg, was thinking the same thing as that happened this weekend about the relationship between people of color from different groups, right? And how these biases are not always black and white. They can come out even between different groups of people of color. And we know, I was looking at the data, and I'm from New York. And so I know, like in inner cities, just sometimes, even though it's very diverse, we don't come together very well, right? Because of some of these biases, and we can have bad intergroup relationships. So it's important to address it, not just from a black and white perspective, but from all different ethnic perspectives and how these biases play out so that we understand how to address them.
I thought that was so important, because when you when I started looking at people, and I was just looking at things this weekend, even the word anti-Asian.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, so you have anti-Asian, you have but you never hear really anti-black or anti-African American. And I was just even looking at the language, how language is played, is used in our community. And I was just like, so, excuse me, I'm having difficulty now.
Very true. Now, I know we're having a little tech. You got lighting, phones, it's all right.
But I was like, because there's so much wrapped in that.
Yes.
You know, so much. And so I was very conscious of that, the language,
yes,
relationships. And I was like, yeah, that's an interesting topic.
And you know what? It's interesting that you mentioned that, because as I've been doing these trainings and, you know, dealing with how to talk about this, I have been strategically, even before this, using anti-black attitudes, right? Because it is what it is, whether it be anti-black, anti-Asian, but you're right. We don't often say that. We often say racism, right? But people oftentimes, even when I do these trainings, don't know how to even define, like, what is it to be racist? What does that mean versus to have these biases, right? Are they the same? You know, as human beings, we have biases. We're not living in a vacuum. We're living in a world where these stereotypes are all over the place. We're trying to do better, but we, as you see, haven't quite gotten there yet, right? And so as we are growing from even early childhood, there's research showing infants are aware of these stereotypes, and you can tell by their looking behaviors and their facial expressions, they're aware. And we've been aware of it all this time. Now, how do we mitigate it? And if we don't tackle this unconscious brain, we're going to keep going into these cycles of bad relationships with different groups of people.
Go ahead, Doc. I'm gonna let you.
You caught me off guard. I was thinking, I was enjoying watching y'all. I do have some questions though about the bias tests that you have given to different groups and how the groups respond to those tests, because I know the results are sometimes not what they expect. And but I also wonder, just going into these tests, do you you get a lot of pushback on the topic? I mean, what is the response that you're getting to the groups where you present these
There's
tests?
pushback, Doc. There's pushback. They get the results and they're like, this is not what I believe. These are not my feelings. And then I have to do the work, right? In terms of what this is capturing, where these biases stem from. You know, I can even actually predict what an individual will get on the race test just by asking them some basic questions. Where'd you grow up? What were the demographics? What's your personality type as well, and what's your friendship circles? Now, I'm not perfect, just like the test isn't perfect, right? But just those questions there. So for example, if you grew up in a predominantly white environment, your friendship circles are predominantly white, and your personality is a certain way in terms of open-mindedness, I can pretty much predict that you're going to have a white bias and be away from neutral. But if you grew up in more diverse circles, your friendship circles are more diverse, your personality is more open-minded, then you're more likely to be at this neutral place or to be able to see groups that are negatively stereotyped in a more positive way, that most folks are just not there. So they're surprised when they get these results. And I've also found there's more pushback against when they get their race results than the gender. So for example, they'll get the race results and be like, no, it's not me, it's the test. It's no way. But when they get the gender test results, they're like, yeah, I understand how I could have gotten that. And so I have to have my trainees take multiple tests to really get it, you know. And even at Georgia Highlands, I work through this with our students, right? They take it, they're like, what does this mean? But we spend 10 weeks in our class just walking through what it means. And by the end of that 10 weeks, they've shifted.
You know,
I know you gave a test to a group of our young African-American men where I was in attendance not too long ago, and there were quite a few of them who tested with a bias toward whiteness.
Yes.
Which was hugely surprising and upsetting to some of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can you, I mean, is that an uncommon result?
It's not uncommon. In fact, in the African-American community, we're about 50-50 split. So about half of us, when we take these assessments, have an inclination to see whiteness as positive. The other half have an inclination to see blackness as positive. And from my research, I dived into, you know, what were the differences there? And it's just about exposure, experiences, right? So African-Americans who grew up in predominantly Black environments, friends are mostly Black, just like white people, right? They're more likely to have an in-group bias, right? But the more diverse African-Americans' friendship circles are, which tend to be more diverse than white, right? Then we have this, what is called a neutral bias when you look at us on aggregated. But in general, most people, when they take this assessment, score a pro-white bias. Those folks who do score a pro-Black bias are Black people or people who may be white and have a lot of Black friends, or maybe white and they may not have many Black friends, but they're just very open-minded. They counteract a lot.
Dr. Gibson, see, but I'm not surprised because if we're honest, we live in a very dominant white culture, white male culture, as Bell Hooks
Yes.
calls white male patriarchy. So I'm not surprised if we as Black people, African Americans, score toward a white bias, pro-white bias. I mean, to me, that kind of makes sense because of everything we are taught. So, Doc, I'm not surprised that, you know, you had some students score that, because I think, and that's one thing I like about the test, the several ones that I've taken, because it really does go deeper than just asking a question.
That's right.
Because
And it has
the question, yes.
Right. It has, like, the research, when I do these trainings, I show people that it's not just a test. There's research showing this test is related to what you do, how you look at people, who you hire, who you fire, who you hang out with. I mean, we can go across the board, right? And also the gender test I'm finding in my research now, most people have a pro-male bias, but women oftentimes have this pro-male bias too, and it's stronger in women than in men. And so I'm obsessed with talking about this, but it's really important for people to understand their own biases, or else we're not going to move anywhere.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to pursue the gender bias test. So we'll talk more about it. No one go away. We'll be right back with a lot more after this.
For 50 years, years, Georgia Highlands College has been a community that takes charge. At GHC, we have a mission to provide access to an outstanding education, meeting the career needs of the region, and helping our communities thrive. Every student we graduate becomes a celebration we never forget. We are more than Chargers. We are Chargers taking charge for 50 years and beyond.
Welcome back to Community Watch. We're having a conversation with Dr. Bentley Gibson, professor of psychology at Georgia Highlands College, about bias and implicit bias testing, which Dr. Gibson does for groups at the college and groups elsewhere. And you had brought up, Dr. Gibson, the gender bias test, and talking about the results that you tend to see on that gender bias test. So tell us a little bit about what you're seeing on those tests.
What I'm seeing is that, okay, remember I said the race test, people of color are split about 50-50. Black people, half of us have a black bias, half of us have a white bias, not on the gender test. So when you look at gender, most people have a male in the workplace bias, but this bias is even stronger in women than it is in men, oftentimes I'm finding. And so even in organizations that have women in leadership there, you will still see this pro-male unconscious bias. And it also is playing out in the cultural climate of those organizations. So when those biases are too strong, there's lack of inclusion of women. There's lack of feeling like they have a work-life bias. But when they're not too strongly pro-male oriented, there's more inclusion, less disparities there. And so we have further even to go in some of these gender areas. And it doesn't only play out between men and women, it also plays out in an in-group orientation as well between women.
Now I could be stretching it, but that's why we have you here as an expert. But does that explain some of when we know women, primarily white women, largely voted for Donald Trump, even though some of the things very misogynistic, some of the things it is known that he done, but yet he still was able to, to garner a large block of women voters. Is that part of a bias?
And even if we just go back and take Donald Trump out of it, if we just look at, Hillary Clinton alone, right? Mm-hmm. Many people were not ready to see that in leadership, not just men, but women as well, right? And so when you look at having the opportunity to have women in leadership, and is that supported or not? There's even research showing that women, when we show dominant traits, personality traits, aggressiveness, or you name it, we can then be disliked because the unconscious brain is so tricky that when we have these biases, we like to see people that fit the stereotype without even realizing. We move towards them, we favor them because they're stereotype congruent. And this is what is happening in the case with gender, very much so.
That's very interesting.
Are the women, especially in a business setting where you've given this test, were they surprised at all?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Especially some of them would even report that they are champion for women's rights initiatives. And so sometimes it's also the heightened awareness of this stereotype. Remember, we're studying the unconscious brain. So we have to realize that women who are particularly in male dominant places are probably very conscious of the stereotype, right? About what women is and have had to be so in order to even get where we are, right? And so that alone could, on this gender level, really increase the unconscious bias there. And more work may need to be done to shift that, not just in men, in women, in children, so that we're not so in tune with this women in home and men in the workplace as leaders.
And Dr. Bentley Gibson, I'm curious. When you're doing tests for groups and you're doing, I guess, one dealing with race, and you said you get a blowback, you get feedback, people push back against it. Is some of that because you, the facilitator, is one Black and female? Because I'm wondering how that plays into that as well. being told that
oftentimes, you know, they don't know who I am until I get there. But I'm very cognizant of that. I mean, doing this for 10 years and learning the strategies that can really reduce biases. I have an opportunity moment here as a Black female in these sessions to reduce bias even myself. That's what the research shows, right? The ways you really shift people is to give them information that counteracts their stereotypes and to shift group boundaries so that it's not us versus them, me versus you, it's we here. And so I'm very strategic about that when I do my trainings, that yes, I'm a Black woman. I don't want to be confirming biases in this moment, but I also want to meet people where they are, which they may not be Black, they may be white, maybe from rural Georgia. You can understand what it's like to be excluded by that. They may be a Republican Trump voter. You can understand what it's like to be excluded by that. And so how can we take these experiences that may be different, but try to understand each other? That's what works. Arguing with folks, confirming stereotypes does not work. And I'm very cognizant of that when I do my trainings. Making them feel guilty and angry. No, one of the first things I do when I do my trainings, I actually report what I got on the test when I took it. I'm a Black woman. When I took it for the first time, I was 18, 19 at Spelman College, and it said I had a slight white bias. And I'm like, wait a minute, how? But then once I thought about it, I'm from White Plains, New York. You know, the status of Black people there, very clear. It made sense to me, even as a Black woman, right? So I share that in my training so that people understand I'm not here to attack you or, you know, make you feel like you're racist or say that you're bad because you got a certain score on this test. I'm very open with how I scored.
And I think that is so key. I think too many times, I believe we have people engaging in racial dialogue that are not necessarily qualified to have those discussions. Just because you have your own personal experiences and beliefs and thoughts doesn't necessarily make you qualified to go really have these deep dive conversations on race or any other topic. Because if you just don't, I'm a man of science. What does the numbers say? What does the data say? As I learned at Morehouse, it's not what you think or feel. It's what does the data say? And so I think sometimes we can do a lot of damage by engaging in conversations that we clearly are not qualified to be holding.
You hit it right on the head, Greg. What does the data say? And so I always go back to the research in terms of what is the effective strategies to help people talk about this, to help reduce bias, to increase diversity in hiring, to improve student performance. What does the research say, right? And my clients are asking me to come in there after people who have come in with emotions and feelings have made the environment even more bias-driven, more uncomfortable. So I have to go in there and then strategize with how to reduce those disparities.
So the benefit of being aware of an unconscious or implicit bias is that you are better able then to try to work against that bias. And is that, I mean, it sounds like your goal in these trainings is not just to identify the existence of bias, but to help people address it and try to eliminate it.
That's right, through a data-driven approach. How do we, on the individual level, every day address this and the behaviors that they're associated with, right? It's one thing to take a test, right? But if it has predictive validity in terms of what I'm gonna do, right? Am I gonna do a microaggression? Am I gonna have poor nonverbal communication with someone just based off of their social group identity, right? Am I gonna unintentionally do something to exclude someone because I wasn't aware? Am I gonna go to an event that could then 5 years even down the line ruin my life because I wasn't thinking and conscious of my biases in that moment? And now I'm Facebook viral. Yeah, right. I was watching, you know, I love to use what's on TV sometimes, right? But I watched the show The Bachelor, and it was a Black bachelor for the first time. And he chose a white girl to be his mate, and she won The Bachelor. And it was beautiful for interracial relationships. This could have been a beautiful story. But what happened was she took a picture maybe 5 years ago when she was at an antebellum party in the South with her sorority. And after winning the show, she fought to get this man. They were in love. He now had to break up with her because he said, you know, you have to do the work first. You know, I know you made a mistake back then. You weren't aware that you being at an antebellum slave home, having a party could be offensive. But now you're aware of it, and I need you to do the work before I can make you my wife, right? Whether it be make someone your partner, a job, a friend who could save your life, right? You just don't know what you could be missing because you have these biases, and that could come and haunt you for the rest of your life.
And that's when you frame it in that way, that's yes, because you're right. We see that every day things go viral simply because of what people said or did,
Right.
and a lot of times I do believe they just didn't know.
That's
They
right.
was not aware,
That's right.
and so many times in my conversations with people, I even have people ask me, is this offensive? Because they don't know.
That's right.
And if you're not doing the work and you haven't taken the time to have these kind of discussions or really dig into the data, it can be it can be a challenge for
It
people.
is. And now you're arguing with folks because you've hurt their feelings and there's no learning moment, right? Versus what is going to actually work here to shift folks. And it takes deep work. It takes personality work. It sometimes takes going back to our childhoods. I've had clients tell me they've had to think about what their grandma told them back in the day. And it's once we do that work and become conscious of these things and change behaviorally, then we will make shifts as individuals, and in the organizations that we're a part of, we'll see the shifts too. People don't know what works though. They're going off of emotions and not data.
Mhm.
I know there are quite a few of these bias tests, and I don't know if you've worked with all of them or not, but one of the tests in particular I thought was interesting, and it was a light skin, dark skin test. Have you had any experience using that test with
I
you?
have. It is, again, the race one has been used and tested more than the light skin dark one, but there's still a lot of research on it showing that people in general across cultures have a bias for light skin in comparison to dark skin. And this starts very early in development. I even saw it when I tested 3 4-year-old children in graduate school. They'll say, oh, I like that one because it's light skin, And so early in development, we have these biases that are not just black, white oriented, but you can even see this cross culturally. Go to Japan, go to Italy, go to Africa. You will, and that's how I bring people of color together as well, realizing that we're fighting the same monster. Oftentimes in America, it's very black and white, but colorism, as you're speaking of, is pretty much consistent across cultures.
Well, I don't fully understand that.
Mm.
But, I mean, I've certainly seen it with students, at least to different levels. But it's remarkable that a bias can be that universal.
Mm-hmm. In my research paper, I call it white bias across cultures. I published that paper just looking at children and how it's pretty consistent. The dominant status group is often favored. Doesn't matter if it's minimal groups, racial groups, color, skin group, it's the dominant status group is the one that is favored cross-culturally. You could take it to how dark your skin is, to even, how thick is your hair, You'll see the same biases playing out very similarly.
And I'm going to suggest, Doc, that it has a lot to do with colonialism.
Yes.
that the dominant culture have stamped universal, like you said. I've been fortunate to travel a lot of countries, and it's so prevalent.
It's same with gender. This gender, women in the household, it's the same everywhere we go. Mostly, even though America has women in the workplace, we don't look that different from countries that don't when it comes to unconscious bias, really. So, we have a lot of work to do.
Well, we are about out of time here, but Dr. Gibson, I appreciate you so much coming to talk to us. And
I want to show you something before you go. I actually wrote this for children to counteract colorism, but also hair bias. How can we get children at an early age to just be happy with their hair, their skin? And this book teaches young kids of color who have natural hair. My hair is magical.
But Dr. Gibson, when Dr. said we was out of time, he meant we had 15 seconds, but he didn't say that. So,
Well, thank you.
Well, you know, I had to let you see it before we go.
Thanks, though. And thank you for being with us on Community Watch.